Welcome. Today we are continuing with English paper 3, the optional texts, and we are in question 3b. A silent song and other stories. War causes a lot of harm and should be avoided at any cost. Validate this statement basing your illustration in Chimamanda Adichie's Ghost. We start with the introduction. Whenever people engage in some form of conflict and fighting, there are grave implications that follow, as is seen in Kcse, where the civil war that happened from the events of July 6, 1967, causing untold suffering and pain to the people. Point number 1, displacement of people. Many people are forced to run away from their country and their homes when the Civil War broke out. Professor James and Ikena's meeting takes James down the memory lane where he recounts how they were forced to evacuate Suka in a hurry in July 6, 1967, when the war began. Through their conversation, we learn that Ikena has lived in Sweden ever since the war began and has only come back to Suka recently. He discloses that he was flown out on Red Cross planes just like many other children had been airlifted to Gabon. Professor James did not escape the displacement since he and his wife, Mbere, had to move to America when the war broke out. Many people are seen to have been forced to leave their motherland as a result of the Civil War. Another cause of harm that war causes, number 2, war leads to loss of lives. Several people had their lives cut short due to the Civil War. The return of Ikena comes as a surprise to Professor James, since Ikena was thought to have died in the war. It is no wonder that Professor initially thought of throwing a handful of sand at him, just like his people did, to ensure that it was not a ghost. Actual loss of life is seen through Ikena's family. While explaining to Professor the reason why he never returned to Suka after the war, Ikena tells him that his whole family was killed when Olu was bombed during the war, thus he had nobody to come back to. It is not just Ikena who lost loved ones, but Professor too. His first daughter Zik died in the war. He tells Ikena that the war took Zik. It is no wonder they named their second daughter Kiruka, which means what is ahead is better. Three, massive destruction and loss of property. When Professor James and his wife first returned to Suka when the war ended in 1970, they noticed major destructions that had occurred. Professor recounts how they found their house and items destroyed. His books were lying in front of the gate, his mathematical annals torn and used as tissue paper, the bathtub used as toilet, and their photos ripped and their frames broken. The massive destruction of their house was too much that they had to be assigned a different house in a different street to avoid seeing their old house. In the process of their house being destroyed, they lost their piano that belonged to Mbere. Professor also remembers the landscape as he drove back to Suka after the war. The massive destruction recounted by Professor shows how destructive war is. 4. Psychological suffering to those who experienced the war and the memories of it. Professor James is seen to have lived with the memories of the war. He easily remembers every detail of the war as he recounts it to Ikena. Ikena has suffered psychologically as is seen from the fact that he lost all his family in Olu as the reason he does not return to Suka. His psychological suffering is further seen from the fact that he never remarries after the war took his wife. Further evidence of psychological pain is seen where Professor observes how his people avoided the topic of war, and if they engaged in it, it was with some vagueness. The naming of their second daughter, Nkiruka, what is ahead is better, also shows the pain that Prof and Mbere were trying to avoid. The people also suffer physical pain. Professor James remembers how a wounded soldier was shoved in their car on the day they returned to Suka. Conclusion: war causes loss of lives, displacement of people, and destruction of properties, among other effects. People should thus strive to live in harmony and avoid it at all costs. Did you understand? Kindly let me know in the comment section below. Also, let me know what video I can look at tomorrow. Thanks a lot for subscribing and listening to me. God bless you.